नमस्कार. विकसे विलसे सौनु ज्ञान चालो रचिए सौ संधान. I welcome all of you in this special program, Sandhan in Samvad. Friends, as you know, this is a very special lecture, and in this special lecture, our star speaker, today's star speaker, are with me, Dr. P.K. Shukla sir, and Mrs. Yatri Shukla. Dr. P.K. Shukla, he has done his PhD in business, and he is the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Chapman University, California. And he is going to talk on the need for innovation in the United States and India in management. Now, I'd like to request Shukla sir. Please, sir.
Great. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very delighted to be here in Ahmedabad in Gujarat State. This is where I was born, in Ahmedabad, and I look forward to sharing some of my insights and what I've learned about management over several years of teaching. I've taught business for about 40 years, and I've noticed a change in the history, the evolution of management theories, the evolution of business concepts, and an evolution in international business, which involves the United States, India, China, Japan, Europe, and the rest of the world. Having taught classes in the United States for MBA students, and also having taught classes for MBA students in Europe, and visiting some of the universities in Ahmedabad, in Gujarat State, in Gandhinagar, I realized that it's very important for anyone who's interested in learning about business to understand what is changing in management theories, both in the United States and also in India. One of the areas of change is the importance of innovation. Many individuals, they pick up the newspaper, they read business books, they read articles, and they learn about the importance of being creative, being innovative, being entrepreneurial. And sometimes individuals make the mistake and think that this is something that has just happened in the last 5 years, or something that has evolved just in the last 10 years. And the reality is that management has increased a need for creativity, a need for innovation over the last several decades. This is something that has evolved over the last 40, 50, 60 years. So today in the lecture, what I would like to do is to share with the audience the history and the timeline for creativity and innovation, the history and the timeline for the need for creativity and the need for innovation in management, and both in the United States and in India in management. Now, I put together a timeline which shows the various evolution, and what I'm going to do is to go through stage by stage, decade by decade, or 20 years at a time, and then sort of explain what occurred in the United States, and at the end to talk about the implications for India. Now, as most of you are aware of history of the world, and most of you are aware of World War I, World War II, what I'd like to do is to start off with the 1940s. In the 1940s, as you are all aware, we had World War II. And this is something which affected the United States, it affected Europe, it affected Japan. The main result of World War II was that Europe had a great deal of destruction in their infrastructure, a great deal of destruction in their factories. Many of the resources of European production, materials, raw materials, equipment, technology, they were utilized for the war effort. So because of the war taking place on the European soil, European factories were for the most part destroyed, and they were suffered in terms of the casualty aspects of the war. Similarly, in Japan, because of the role that they played in World War II and the United States invasions, there also Japan was having an impact on their factories. So the result was that in the 1940s, the American factories were pretty much left intact. There was no major damage to American factories on American mainland soil, other than what we did see with Pearl Harbor and Hawaii. As a result, American manufacturers and American managers, they acted like monopolists. They basically could produce anything they wanted, sell it for any price they wanted, and sell it everywhere in the world. There was no competition. So as a result, in the 1940s, American managers acted like monopolists. And because of this, there was a tremendous amount of economic growth in the 1950s and the 1960s. American factories were able to expand, they increased new production, they came up with new ideas, new products, and also American labor was benefiting from this growth. This was a period where wages were increased in the United States. We had a large percentage of unionization in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. Unions demanded more wages, they demanded more benefits, they demanded more concessions from management. And the labor demands were met. And the reason the labor demands were met because there was no competition from Europe, there was no competition from Japan. At the time, China was not really a major dominant player in international business. India was not a major dominant player in international business. So in the 1950s and 1960s, American companies were able to grow tremendously, a lot of manufacturing base and a lot of increase. Now, this led to price differences for American workers. The hourly wages paid to American workers started to rise above that of other countries. So at the time, Japanese labor was cheaper in the 1950s. Japanese labor was cheaper in the 1960s than American labor. So what we started to see was a change, and the change occurred in the 1970s. And starting in the 1970s, we started to see imports which came into the United States. And primarily in the 1970s, most of the imports started initially coming from Japan. And then we also started to see imports from Taiwan. Now, the main advantage that these foreign importers had was lower prices. And the reason they had lower prices was because of lower wages. The unions in the United States had priced themselves out of a globally competitive marketplace for labor. And as a result, Japanese labor was able to benefit from lower wages that were in Japan. The prices were lower for Japanese imports in the United States. Taiwanese imports were lower price in the United States. So the United States started to see a trade deficit. And in the 1970s, there was a lot of friction in political discussions between the United States and Japan over the causes of the trade deficit with the U.S. and Japan and what the remedies should be. And there were all sorts of ideas, suggestions. American manufacturers, American managers said that Japan was a closed market. Japan did not believe in free trade. The Japanese government officials did not encourage free trade. Now, in their defense, the Japanese managers and government officials said they were not trying to restrict American imports into Japan. But what they said was that American managers did not understand the Japanese consumers. American managers did not adapt their marketing. They did not adapt their product to the Japanese market. So the Japanese response was that Americans were not selling in Japan because of their own problems, because of their own lack of adaptation. So America realized in the 1960s and 1970s that they would no longer be able to compete on low prices. Once the unions had created the higher wages and labor had created higher wage structure, they were not going to return back to lower wages. It was not going to be possible for unions to say, we accept a 25% pay cut, we accept a 30, 40, 50% pay cut. That was not going to happen. So America faced a difficult period of time trying to figure out how do we reduce the trade deficit. And I remember there was an interesting discussion that was held in the United States Congress. There was a very famous economist, world-class famous economist. His name was John Kenneth Galbraith. And John Kenneth Galbraith went to Congress in 1970, early 1970s, and he said that there is a serious problem in the United States. And the serious problem is that manufacturing jobs are leaving the United States. Manufacturing production is leaving the United States. Factories are being shut down in the United States. Now, he explained the cause for this was that in the 1940s and 1950s, Americans did not need to worry about foreign factories. They were small, they were destroyed, they were not effective, they had low volume. But now it was around 1970, 30 years after World War II. Now, 30 years after World War II, European factories were more modern. They had more automation, they had newer machines, newer technology. Japanese factories were more automated. They had newer machinery, newer equipment. And what John Kenneth Galbraith said was that in the United States, where we had most of the manufacturing base, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, with auto manufacturing, it became known as what was called the Rust Belt, R-U-S-T-B-E-L-T, Rust Belt. And it was called the Rust Belt because the factories were getting old. The machinery was getting old. The machines were getting rusted. And as a result, if you had to compete with something made in America in a Rust Belt factory or something competing with a European factory, Japanese factory, the European production was much more modern. The Japanese production was much more modern. So John Kenneth Galbraith was very wise, and he said that we have a choice. And he went to Congress in the United States and said, at one point, 99% of the electronics in the entire world were made in the United States. Television sets, black and white television sets, color television sets in the United States. Also, things such as tire, steel, most of the tires produced in the entire world were produced in the United States. Firestone tire, Goodyear tire. So what John Kenneth Galbraith said is that we could keep jobs in the United States for manufacturing. And what he recommended to Congress was what he called a plan, and his plan was the reindustrialization of America. Some of you have probably read in your history of business the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Era, the industrial phase of time around the 1890s, 1900. What John Kenneth Galbraith said was that jobs could be kept in the United States in manufacturing if Congress were to give tax subsidies, government assistance, government support, so that manufacturers, companies, their shareholders, their board of directors, owners of private factories, they would invest in new equipment. And their incentive to invest in new equipment would be to get a tax credit. So if you spent 50,000 US dollars to upgrade your equipment, you might get a tax benefit, 25,000, so that the government would assist you in your rebuilding efforts. Now, John Kenneth Galbraith proposed this to Congress, and he was expecting and hoping perhaps that they would approve the recommendations. Unfortunately, in the 1970s, with the imports coming in from Japan and Europe, other parts of the world, Taiwan, the United States Congress disagreed with them, and they said, no, we do not want to support manufacturing in the United States. We do not care to save manufacturing jobs in the United States. And when John Kenneth Galbraith asked the question, why is it you do not want to support manufacturing jobs in the U.S., what Congress said was that these are lower wage positions, these are lower wage jobs. There's no future in manufacturing for the United States. What Congress said is that the future for the United States is in computers, technology, the information age, the digital era. So what Congress said was that we are not going to give a tax subsidy, we're not going to give assistance because new jobs will be created in computers, making computers, programming computers, maintenance of computers, setting up computer systems, networks. And Americans will get high-paid, high-wage positions in the computer field, information technology, information systems. It was going to be called the information era, the information-based economy, the information age. Now, it's really ironic because what Congress said in the 1970s was that all of these IS jobs, all of these IT jobs are going to be kept in the United States. Now we know today in the year 2009 and on the eve of 2010, we know that many of the information system jobs have gone outside of the United States, and India in particular, Bangalore, Ahmedabad, Gujarat State, other parts of India. We have benefited from the outsourcing of IT positions, computer programming, technology centers throughout India, major investments by firms such as Microsoft, IBM, Tata Consultancy Services. India has gained all of these positions. And it's really ironic because this is what Congress was saying. the jobs would be staying in America. So now looking again at the timeline, manufacturing jobs were basically leaving the United States, and Congress basically said, we do not care about imports. Since the 1970s, the trade deficit in the United States has continued to increase constantly, and the trade deficit is never going to disappear in the United States just simply because we manufacture so much and we import so much. Now, one of the major changes in management theory occurred in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, what we began to realize is that Americans were buying Japanese cars, and Japanese cars were more expensive than American cars. And in the United States, they had trade quotas, they had duties, they had tariffs, they had customs regulations, and they were trying to add an excise tax to every imported Japanese car. So if you were an American consumer in the 1980s, you could buy an American-made car or you could buy a Japanese car. And in the 1980s, what American consumers were saying is that we would rather buy a Japanese-made car, even if it is more expensive. So this led to American manufacturers and American auto manufacturers, managers, to ask the question, why? Why would you pay more money for a car made in Japan and imported into the U.S.? Why not buy a car made in America, which is lower price? And the answer that consumers gave was that we do not want to buy American-made cars because we perceive and we believe that the Japanese auto manufacturing is better quality.